I still remember the exact time it happened, 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late September. The air was dry, the sky hazy with the fading smoke of distant wildfires, and I was standing by the north gate of my property, waiting for a truck that never made it past the cul-de-sac. It should have been just another grain delivery. One of three I'd arranged for the fall, prepping quietly like I always did. But this one would mark the beginning of a storm I hadn't seen coming. The truck was a white Peterbilt rig, hauling 18 tons of dry milo grain, contracted from a supplier I'd used for over a decade. Nothing illegal, nothing unusual. I had a certified grain storage facility just off my barn, built to code, inspected annually. I wasn't stockpiling weapons or building bunkers, just grain. The kind that when shelves go bare keeps people alive. I could see the rig's chrome grille glinting behind the ornamental hedge that separated Willowbrook Estates, a planned suburban HOA nightmare, from my 5-acre parcel that had existed long before the HOA even filed their articles of incorporation. My land was carved out decades before the HOA acquired the surrounding plots. My deed was clean, no easements, no HOA obligations. But try telling that to Karen Halstead. Karen was the self-appointed president of the HOA, the kind of woman who wore tennis skirts without ever playing tennis and barked into Bluetooth earpieces as if she were negotiating hostage releases. She lived 2 streets over, but that never stopped her from monitoring the gate camera I had mounted years before the HOA existed. And it sure didn't stop her from driving her Lexus SUV right up to the delivery truck that afternoon and parking broadside to block it. I walked down from the gate, boots crunching over gravel, heart sinking with every step. The driver, a kid named Ricky who couldn't have been more than 22, leaned halfway out his window, confusion all over his sunburnt face. "She says I'm not allowed in," he called out. "Said this is HOA land." "It's not," I said flatly. "It's mine. Stay put." Karen had exited her vehicle, now holding a clipboard like a weapon. "This delivery is in direct violation of Section 14 of the Willowbrook HOA covenants," she announced as though it were the 10 Commandments. "No industrial-scale operations are permitted within residential zones." I nearly laughed. "This isn't a residential zone. This is agricultural exemption land. I've shown you the maps before." She smiled, a tight, pinched expression. "We've recently updated our community boundaries." I took a long breath, staring past her at the motionless truck. My throat tightened. "You redrew your maps to include my land." She didn't answer, but the answer was obvious. I turned back to Ricky. "Go ahead and back out. I'll call you when this is handled." He gave me an apologetic shrug and eased the rig into reverse, his tires kicking up dust as he maneuvered out of the cul-de-sac. I stood there, fists clenched, while Karen scribbled something smugly onto her clipboard. "You'll be receiving formal notice," she said. That night, I sat at my kitchen table sipping lukewarm coffee and rereading the property plat for the 100th time. Every square foot of my land was mine, free and clear. I'd inherited it from my father, who bought it after serving in Korea. He raised me here, taught me to plant with the moon and harvest by instinct. I left at 18 to serve 25 years in the Army, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. When I came home, I rebuilt the barn, put up fencing, poured my soul into the earth. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came for peace, and I never imagined that it would be a grain truck that turned my world upside down. The next morning, a letter was nailed to the wooden gate. It read, "To Mr. Granger Holt. You are in violation of HOA Aesthetic Standards Clause 14 and zoning agreements as of September 24th. All large-scale agricultural deliveries must cease immediately. Failure to comply will result in penalties and potential legal action." I stared at the letter for a long time. Then I folded it neatly, walked to my barn, and tucked it into a file labeled Evidence. Overreach. I didn't retaliate, not yet. I didn't call the sheriff or march down to Karen's McMansion. Instead, I got on the phone with Ricky's company and rescheduled the delivery. I figured this would blow over. That maybe someone on the HOA board would realize they had no jurisdiction and shut her down before she dragged the whole community into legal quicksand. I underestimated just how far she'd go. 3 days later, I received a certified envelope. Inside, a $1,750 fine for infrastructure strain, a demand to remove my grain bins, and a photograph of my storage shed with a red circle drawn around it like it was a crime scene. I knew then this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. And it had only just begun. I've never considered myself a confrontational man. Maybe that surprises people now, especially the ones who saw the headlines months later. But the truth is, I didn't move back here to make a statement. I came back because I wanted silence. The kind of silence that sits with you at sunrise when mist rolls over hay bales, and the only thing you hear is your own heartbeat and the ticking of dew sliding down barn tin. After the Army, I could have stayed in Fayetteville or moved out west. But this land? It was more than home. It was the only place where I didn't wake up reaching for my sidearm at 2 a.m. or duck at the sound of a car backfiring. This land gave me back my breathing. So when I built the grain shed, it wasn't for profit. It wasn't for some doomsday prepper fantasy either, like Karen probably told her board members. I'd been burned once back in 2013, when an ice storm shut down the entire county for 6 days. I watched young families go hungry. The local market ran out of baby formula in 2 hours, and I had food plenty of it. But I didn't have a system in place. I had no way to distribute it, no way to preserve it in that kind of cold. I swore I'd never be that unprepared again. So over the next few years, I invested slowly. A grain storage system with solar backup. A cool room bunker built not underground, but inside the barn. Shelf-stable items, vacuum-sealed rice, and wheat oxygen absorbers, a manual grinder. I kept spreadsheets. I studied shelf life like a science. By the time I moved back permanently after retirement, I'd spent almost 7 years getting it right. This wasn't just my hobby. It was insurance for the town. But try explaining that to people who think preparedness is a dirty word. I knew what the HOA thought of me. The whispers had been there for years, especially after I refused to sign into their association. When Willow Brook was built, they tried to envelop every homeowner around it into their master plan. But they couldn't touch my parcel. My deed had agricultural designation, and it was recorded independently from their plat. I'd refused their initial overtures and politely returned their welcome basket. And from that moment on, I was marked. Still, I'd kept my head down. I didn't mow at odd hours. I didn't blast music. I helped neighbors when they asked, jumped car batteries, helped move a broken swing set, even lent a generator during last summer's brownout. But when I tried to bring in that grain delivery, something changed. I didn't know it then, but Karen had been escalating her power grab behind closed doors. She'd been pushing for amendments in the HOA bylaws that allowed them to expand aesthetic authority to adjacent parcels deemed to influence community visual appeal. It was nonsense, legally toothless, but it sounded official, and in HOA world, that was often enough. I sat in the shed that week watching dust drift through the morning light, thinking about how fragile it all really was. A woman with a clipboard could undo decades of quiet preparation just because she didn't like how a storage bin looked from her breakfast nook. I called a friend of mine, Tomas, a county ag inspector I'd served with in the reserves. He still owed me for pulling him out of a flooded Humvee back in Louisiana, and he never forgot it. She can't enforce anything beyond the HOA plat, he said immediately. Your parcel's grandfathered zoned separately. That shed is legal as air. Then why does she keep acting like she owns my fence line? Tomas snorted. Because she thinks no one will fight her. Most people fold. I didn't say anything, but I didn't fold. Later that day, I got in the truck and drove 40 minutes down to the Agricultural Extension office. I brought the plat maps, the deed history, even the soil reports. The clerk looked confused when I asked if an HOA could overrule state zoning. They can't, she said simply. But that doesn't stop them from making life miserable. That stuck with me. I could be right. I could have the law on my side. But in the meantime, they could still drain my time, my wallet, my peace. They didn't need to win in court. They just had to wear me down. When I got back, I found 2 more violations taped to the fence. One for unauthorized signage, referring to my private property, no trespassing sign, and one for visual pollution, citing my metal grain bins as obtrusive. Obtrusive. I stared at the letter until my hands shook. Then I walked over to the gate, bolted it shut, and replaced the sign with a bigger one. This property is not under HOA jurisdiction. Trespassers will be recorded and prosecuted. I also installed trail cameras, 6 of them hidden in trees, fence posts, and under the eaves of the barn. I rerouted the Wi-Fi signal from my backup satellite unit so that even if they cut my main line, I'd still have a feed. I knew how these games were played. I'd done counterintelligence in Kandahar. Karen Halstead might think she was smart, but I'd dealt with people who ran fake marketplaces to lure soldiers into traps. I'd seen entire supply chains vanish overnight because one convoy ignored a warning. And that's exactly what this was now, a warning. They weren't just annoyed. They were organizing. And if I didn't play this carefully, they'd find a way to do more than block trucks. They'd try to starve me out of my own land. But they didn't know what I had in place, not yet. They didn't know what I'd spent the last 10 years preparing for. And I was about to find out just how fragile their own little kingdom really was. The next board meeting was held the following Thursday evening in the clubhouse on Birchwood Lane, a building that looked more like a wedding venue than a place to discuss tree trimming and trash schedules. It had white columns, chandeliers, and an HOA-funded espresso machine. Residents gathered in freshly pressed polos and yoga pants, sipping lattes like it was Sunday brunch. I parked my beat-up F-250 right in front. I hadn't attended one of these meetings before. Technically, I wasn't obligated to. But that night I walked into their turf, not because I believed they would change, but because I needed them to know I wasn't going away quietly. There was a low murmur as I entered, heads turned, and I felt every eye fall on me. To them, I was the strange man on the hill, the guy who didn't follow the rules, who let crops grow higher than the ornamental grass. Karen Halstead stood at the front with a microphone beaming with the artificial warmth of a pageant queen. Her hair was pinned perfectly, not a strand out of place. She wore a navy blazer over a cream blouse, her battle uniform. "Oh, Mr. Holt," she said, eyes locking on mine. "I see you finally decided to participate in the community process. I didn't take the bait. I came to hear the board explain their recent attempt to seize jurisdiction over my land." She blinked, then smiled wider. "Please take a seat. We'll be addressing that under new business." I sat near the back, arms folded, listening as they ran through mundane updates, a broken fountain, new mulch guidelines, dog leash enforcement. It was surreal hearing them fuss over mailbox paint, while knowing they were actively sabotaging my life outside that room. Then Karen cleared her throat and introduced the agenda item titled Perimeter Aesthetic Concerns. A young man, Justin, I think, stepped forward. He was the HOA's Landscape Harmony Coordinator, whatever that meant. He clicked his tablet, and an aerial image of Willowbrook Estates popped up on the projector. My parcel sat just beyond the development like an ink blot on a clean napkin. A big red border encircled it, now photoshopped into their version of community concern. This property, Justin said, although not technically under HOA membership, directly affects the visual harmony of our neighborhood. He tapped again. A grainy image of my grain bins filled the screen taken from someone's upstairs window. "We believe Mr. Holt's recent increase in industrial activity poses a long-term threat to home values, communal branding, and neighborhood aesthetics." I stood. Industrial activity, I store food on private land during an unstable time in our country's supply chain. Karen held up her hand like a traffic cop. "You'll have time to speak after public comment." Someone behind me muttered, "Why doesn't he just move?" I turned and met their eyes, because I was here first. A few gasps. Karen pressed forward. After a unanimous vote last month, the board approved a boundary enhancement proposal, which was filed with the Local Land Adjustment Board. While still pending final review, we've adopted the new perimeter as part of our provisional guidelines. Provisional? I nearly laughed. So they were acting as if the land was theirs, before it had even been approved. This wasn't oversight. It was aggression, dressed in paperwork. She continued, "Therefore, Mr. Holt will receive notices like any other resident, and is expected to comply with baseline aesthetic expectations, especially regarding large vehicle deliveries, storage visibility, and perceived noise violations." I waited until she finished. Then I walked to the front. "I have my deed with me," I said, holding up the original plat map yellowed from age. "I have letters from the county zoning board affirming my exemption. And I have affidavits from the local ag extension and supply company confirming the legality of my deliveries." Karen smiled sweetly. "That's all very moving, Mr. Holt, but community peace often requires more than legality. It requires cooperation." I looked across the sea of faces, mostly suburban professionals, who'd moved here for quiet lawns and HOA-managed comfort. None of them had ever lost a crop to drought or helped bury a starving horse during a famine overseas. They didn't understand what hunger meant, but they were about to. You think this is about appearances, I said, my voice steady. You're blocking food. You're interfering with emergency grain storage in a time when prices are spiking and storms are coming. This isn't about property values. It's about control. A woman in the second row, a mother, maybe shifted uncomfortably. Her arms crossed tighter. I could see a flicker of doubt. I'm not trying to turn Willowbrook into a grain hub. I'm trying to protect this place when things go wrong. Karen stepped up to the mic again. We appreciate your passion, but we also must be stewards of uniformity. If everyone decided to store large silos or bring in trucks, we'd no longer have a neighborhood. We'd have chaos. No, I said quietly, you'd have food. Silence fell. Then Karen moved to adjourn the topic, but I wasn't done. Before I left, I handed a sealed envelope to their legal liaison. Inside was a letter from my attorney citing the exact state and county codes protecting agricultural exemptions and affirming that the HOA had no authority to enforce policies on my land. It warned them of impending legal action if harassment or interference continued. And I added something else, a photo. It was a black and white image, grainy and dated, showing my father loading sacks of wheat into a wagon during the blizzard of '78. The road was iced over, but he'd made it into town with enough grain to feed the church, the school, and the firehouse. On the back, I'd written, "We don't always know when the storm is coming, but some of us prepare anyway." I walked out, not waiting for applause or rebuttal. I didn't need their approval. I had crops to protect. The next morning, I was already in my truck before sunrise, a thermos of bitter black coffee in one hand and a folder of evidence on the seat beside me. I'd been calm the night before, maybe even too calm. But by dawn, that quiet had turned to fire. I wasn't just dealing with petty neighborhood politics anymore. The HOA had stepped into dangerous territory, disrupting the supply of food during a time of growing instability. And I wasn't going to let them win by attrition. The county courthouse sat just outside the city limits, a red brick building with weathered steps and a parking lot lined with county trucks and dusty sedans. I'd been there before decades ago when my father filed his water rights paperwork. Now it was my turn not to ask for anything, but to defend what was already mine. I met with Teresa Merrick, the county land use coordinator, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who wore her glasses on a chain and spoke like she was always 5 minutes from her next meeting. I'd called ahead and requested time on her calendar, and to her credit, she gave me 30 minutes. She flipped through my documentation quickly: original deed, plat maps, zoning approvals, and 3 recent letters from the AG department confirming my land's agricultural designation. "You're not under any HOA governance," she said without hesitation. "None of their recorded plats intersect your parcel. Their recent boundary proposal hasn't even cleared review. It's a procedural stunt." I leaned back. Can they act on it anyway? "Issue fines, block deliveries." Teresa pursed her lips. "Technically, no. But if you don't fight it publicly, they might get away with it long enough to establish a precedent. That's how these things creep, slowly, silently, and then suddenly they're in control." That last sentence hit harder than she probably meant it to. I'd seen the same thing happen in combat zones, militias taking over regions, not through battles, but through slow erosion of law. Control the water, control the market, control the access. And eventually people give in because fighting feels harder than surrendering. "I want to escalate," I said firmly. "I want a formal hearing before the county zoning board. I want it on record that they're trying to expand illegally." She nodded, pulling a form from her desk. "I'll put you on the agenda for next Thursday. But I'll warn you, Willowbrook Estates has influence. Karen Halstead's husband is a developer. They've donated to local council campaigns." "I'm not asking for favors," I said. "I'm asking for the law." That night, I drafted my statement for the hearing. I didn't want it to sound like a rant or some grudge match. I wanted facts, timelines, receipts. I listed the exact date the HOA began targeting me. I included the time-stamped footage from the gate when they blocked the grain truck, the photos of Karen standing in front of the vehicle, and her letter citing aesthetic concerns as justification for halting emergency supplies. And then, I did something more important. I included community testimonials. Over the years, I'd helped neighbors. Quietly, without fuss. I called them now. Jenny Wu, whose husband had a diabetic crash during the blackout. I'd given them insulin stored in my solar fridge. The Conways, who ran out of baby formula 2 winters ago. I'd handed them 3 vacuum-sealed bags of powdered milk from my stock. I didn't ask them to take sides, I just asked them to tell the truth. By Thursday, I had 7 signed letters of support and 3 people willing to testify in person. I packed my folder, ironed a shirt I hadn't worn since my retirement ceremony, and drove to the zoning board like I was heading into a different kind of battlefield. The hearing room was small, just 8 council members seated behind a long table, and maybe 20 folding chairs for the public. Karen was already there when I walked in, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit with a manila folder of her own. She didn't look at me, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders like a queen sensing the ground shifting beneath her throne. When it was my turn, I stood at the lectern and spoke slowly, clearly. My name is Granger Holt. I live on a 5-acre parcel adjacent to Willowbrook Estates. That land has been in my family for over 40 years. It is zoned for agricultural use and is not under the jurisdiction of the Willowbrook HOA. Despite this, I've been targeted for months. My grain deliveries intended for emergency preparedness have been blocked. I've received unauthorized fines, threats of legal action, and harassment. I'm here today to protect not just my rights, but the future safety of this community. I submitted my evidence. The council members flipped through the binders, murmuring to one another. Karen was called next. She rose gracefully and smiled as if she were presenting at a gala. Willowbrook simply wishes to preserve the beauty and cohesion of our community, she said. When a neighboring parcel engages in industrial-scale operations, it affects our residents emotionally and economically. A few council members raised their brows. One of them, an older man named Darius, asked, "Can you clarify how emergency grain storage qualifies as industrial?" Karen hesitated. Large trucks, visible silos. The optics are unsettling. That word, optics, hung in the air like a bad smell. I watched as the council quietly realized what this was really about. Before the hearing ended, Jenny Wu stood up. She wasn't on the schedule, but the chair allowed it. "I just want to say something," she began. "Last year, my husband collapsed during the power outage. The pharmacy was closed. Granger was the only one who had what we needed. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask for anything. And now you're telling me the people who run the neighborhood newsletter think he's a threat." Silence. Karen shifted uncomfortably. I could see the cracks forming. When the board adjourned, they promised to review everything and issue a written decision. I walked out to the parking lot with Jenny and the Conways. No one said much. But in their eyes, I saw something Karen had lost long ago: trust. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about who people would turn to when things really went wrong. It started with the wind. Long, low growls over the hills that didn't feel like autumn anymore. Leaves turned brittle overnight, snapping off the trees in bunches. The ground hardened, and the usual soft rains of October vanished into a gray cold that crept under doors and up spines. Everyone felt it coming, even if no one could say what it was yet. Local news called it an Arctic mass surge, the kind of event that made headlines only when things got bad enough. But I'd seen the satellite models, and I knew better. This wasn't just another cold front. It was going to gut the supply chain like a knife through gut canvas. The shelves at Jensen's Market started emptying 3 days before the first snow. Milk was gone in hours. Bread lasted a little longer, but not much. Canned goods vanished. The storm hadn't even arrived, but panic was already setting in. Karen and her HOA board, meanwhile, were still posting about lighted wreath regulations on their online bulletin. Then came the emergency weather alert. It was broadcast across state networks, county radio, and even that tinny emergency phone buzz that made you feel like something out of a war movie. The state was officially urging citizens to shelter in place, warning of freezing temperatures, ice-laden power lines, and disruptions in both food and medical logistics. That was their polite way of saying, you're on your own for a while. I stood in the barns that night checking the grain bins one last time. Sealed tight. Pressure balanced, 2,000 pounds of Milo, 800 pounds of winter wheat, 3 full drums of stabilized oats. On the wall was my handwritten inventory, updated weekly, precise to the ounce. And in the corner, an old radio crackled to life. It was the emergency broadcast repeating, but I wasn't listening to the words. I was watching the power flicker. The lights died at 11:04 p.m. I didn't panic. I walked to the back wall and flipped the breaker that rerouted to the solar inverter and backup battery. The lights blinked once, then came back online, dimmer but steady. I waited. Nothing else came. Just silence. Heavy absolute. I knew then the grid was down. The next morning, I ventured into Willowbrook Estates just far enough to see for myself. The streets were empty. Every porch had frost crawling up its columns. Sprinklers had frozen into brittle claws of ice. A few houses had generators small, loud, and sputtering like dying lawnmowers, but most didn't. People weren't prepared. They'd trusted that someone else, some department, some agency, some HOA, would protect them when the time came. I passed the Halstead residence. The lights were out. Curtains drawn. No car in the drive. I saw movement inside Shadow's faint candlelight. Later that afternoon, I got the first knock on my gate. It was a teenage boy, maybe 17, wearing a college hoodie and thin gloves. His breath fogged in the air. I recognized him, Nico, from the house 2 lots down from Karen's. "Mr. Holt," he asked, voice cracking from cold, "do you have any food or heat packs? My sister's sick." I didn't hesitate. I handed him a thermal blanket, 3 meal packs, and a gallon of pre-boiled water. He looked stunned. "Thank you. We tried the market, but they're closed." The HOA told my mom not to panic. I looked him in the eyes. "Take this. Come back tomorrow if you need more. And tell your mom preparation isn't panic." By sunset, 6 more families had shown up. And every one of them whispered the same thing Karen told us: this wasn't going to happen. That evening, I opened the barn to full capacity. I set up the emergency lanterns, connected the small propane heater, and posted a sign at the edge of my property. Emergency Relief Center. No HOA authority. Supplies for families in need. I knew it would make waves, but I didn't care anymore. At 8:22 p.m., Karen herself arrived, wrapped in a cashmere scarf and fur-lined boots. Her makeup had cracked slightly in the cold, and she was shivering under a white coat better suited for Aspen than the back roads of a frozen suburb. She didn't knock. She yelled from the gate, "Granger, this is unauthorized." I stepped out with a headlamp on, not bothering to raise my voice. "So were your fines. You can't offer supplies without board approval. This could be seen as a liability." I held up a clipboard on it, a signed letter from the County Emergency Management Office. Dated that morning. It read, "Mr. Holt's facility is hereby designated an unofficial auxiliary relief hub under State Emergency Code 12.3. The county thanks him for his civic support." Karen froze. Her lips parted. She tried to speak, but no words came. I added, "You're welcome to come in and warm up, Karen, but only if you leave the clipboard outside." She didn't enter. She turned and walked back to her SUV, slipping once on the ice, and drove off without headlights. That night, more families came. Elderly couples, parents with infants, people I'd never spoken to before. And I fed them all, gave them blankets, quieted their fears. I didn't ask for names. I didn't ask for apologies. But I noticed something else. Not one of them used the word HOA. They said Karen, or the board, or them. Something had shifted. The storm had stripped away the illusion of control, of safety, of hierarchy. And now they weren't looking for compliance. They were looking for help, and I had more to give. The storm didn't let up. Day after day, the temperature dipped lower and the wind howled like something alive. Snow crusted the roads in sheets so thick that even the county plows gave up on our stretch of town. The power grid remained down for 5 days straight. And through it all, the barn stayed lit, warm and humming, thanks to solar panels, old-school prep, and years of discipline. Word spread fast. What started with 6 families doubled by the second day, then doubled again. We weren't just giving out supplies anymore, we were organizing. I printed out handouts: how to insulate a bedroom with blankets and furniture, how to boil water safely, how to store body heat in shared spaces. It became routine meals in the morning, restocking inventory, at noon lantern checks in the evening. I hardly slept, but I'd never felt more alive. Then the letters came. I found them taped to my gate, wrapped in plastic, weighed down with a rock to keep them from blowing away. The first one, in bold type, Notice of Enforcement. Unauthorized assembly on private property. You are in violation of HOA Code 17.4b regarding the use of land for non-approved gatherings. Cease and desist immediately. Failure to comply will result in escalating penalties. The gall of it made me laugh out loud. My hands trembled not from fear, but rage. In the middle of a statewide emergency with families freezing and children hungry, Karen Halstead and her board still had the audacity to think that paperwork gave them authority. I posted the letter on the barn wall under the sign HOA attempts to stop Food Aid Exhibit A. The next morning, another envelope arrived. This one listed a fine of $300 for unsanctioned use of an agricultural structure for public purposes. They'd even tried to fine me retroactively for noise pollution because of the diesel truck that tried to deliver grain 2 weeks earlier. I tacked that one to the wall too, but the worst wasn't on paper. It came at 3 a.m. on the fourth night of the blackout. A metallic clank woke me sharp fast, like steel hitting steel. I was sleeping in the corner of the barn, wrapped in a cot and blanket. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the small flashlight clipped to the wall. Another sound, this time a hiss, then a crunch of gravel. Footsteps. I moved silently to the door boots, slipping into place like muscle memory from years on deployment. The cold air bit my skin as I stepped out. Then I saw it. Someone had unbolted the fuel tank from the backup generator and tipped it, spilling 5 gallons of diesel into the snow. The red fuel glistened like blood in the lantern light. The generator itself was still intact, thank God, but the sabotage was clear. They hadn't just sent letters now. They were trying to break me. I checked the perimeter. Footprints in the snow led back to the fence line near Willowbrook's eastern walking trail. It was too dark to follow them far, but I didn't need to. I knew who was behind it. The next morning, I reported the vandalism to the sheriff. Deputy Alvarez showed up 3 hours later, young and uncertain, probably pulled from another call across the county. His patrol SUV crunched over frozen gravel as he stepped out, rubbing his hands and scanning the property. Got the report, he said, looking tired. Generator tampering. Right there, I said, pointing to the spilled fuel and loose bolts. Camera caught the whole thing. Trail cam on the east post. Want the footage? He nodded. Please. Honestly, we've had 5 cases of fuel theft already. But this looks more personal. I handed him the drive. He watched a few seconds on his tablet, then raised an eyebrow. That's someone from the HOA. Look at the boots, I said. Those aren't worker boots. Those are Sperry's. He sighed. We'll open a case. No promises. Most of our investigators are stretched thin with the crisis. But if it escalates, it already did. I pointed to the dozens of people still huddled in the barn, wrapped in blankets, sipping rehydrated soup. Alvarez exhaled. You're doing good work here. County officials are watching, by the way. My captain mentioned your name during the emergency briefing this morning. That caught my attention. What did he say? He shrugged. That maybe the state should have had 10 more of you. That night, I doubled the cameras, reinforced the fuel cage, started sleeping with the generator key around my neck. But I also made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for the HOA to trip over themselves again. I was going to expose them. The next day, I reached out to a local journalist, Delia Bryant. She'd written a piece last year on HOA corruption in a nearby town and had a knack for sniffing out entitlement dressed as governance. I sent her the trail cam footage, the letters, the fines, the footage of families lining up for food, while Karen posted HOA announcements about driveway salt restrictions. She called me within 2 hours. Granger, this is gold, she said. But I have to ask, are you ready for the spotlight? Because once I publish this, they won't be able to hide behind HOA codes anymore. They'll come at you harder. I thought about my father, how he used to tell me. If you're catching flack, you're over the target. Let them, I said. I've got more fuel in the tank than they think. The article went live the next morning. HOA blocks. Emergency grain relief while families freeze one farmer's fight for his land. It spread fast. Facebook, Reddit, even the local AM radio stations. By noon, reporters were calling my burner line. The sheriff's office issued a statement calling the vandalism under investigation. And that night, my barn was filled with more people than ever. But something else happened too. 2 HOA board members showed up quietly without fanfare. They didn't argue. They didn't defend Karen. They just volunteered. One helped stir soup. The other passed out gloves. And in that moment, I saw something shift, not just in the barn, but in the neighborhood. The illusion of control was cracking. Karen might still have her title, but the people were walking away. Not toward politics, but toward purpose. And I would lead them there. The official declaration came on the 6th day of the blackout, though for many of us, it felt more like confirmation than news. We'd already been living at rationing food, melting snow for water, checking on the elderly 3 times a day. Still, when the governor's televised address aired through backup radio and scratchy shortwave stations, something in the air changed. "This is a statewide emergency," she announced, standing stiffly behind a podium, eyes tired but firm. "With more than half the counties experiencing infrastructure failure and rural logistics at a standstill, we are authorizing auxiliary distribution centers to provide emergency food fuel and medical supplies, effective immediately." She listed counties. Ours was among them. My name wasn't spoken, not on camera. But 2 hours later, I received a call from the County Emergency Operations Center. A woman named Sheila identified herself as the Deputy Logistics Director and said, "We've got you on our resilience list. We've been tracking what you've done." I blinked, confused. "Resilience list," she chuckled dryly. "A list of private operators already filling gaps in the system, people who've stepped up before we even knew who to call. You're at the top, Mr. Holt." I leaned against the barn post, hand tightening around my thermos. "What do you need?" "We'd like to designate your farm as an auxiliary emergency distribution point, officially. You'd be authorized to receive state-contracted shipments and issue rations. Do you have capacity?" I glanced around the barn at the stacked bins, the dry racks, the prep stations I'd built with bare hands. It was a fortress, not just against storms, but against failure. "I do," I said. "How soon?" "Tomorrow morning. Grain and medical kits." "And Mr. Holt, thank you." After I hung up, I sat down at my workbench and let it wash over me. The years of being dismissed, the condescension from HOA meetings, the sabotage, the fines, it all fell away. I hadn't just been vindicated, I'd been trusted by the state. But before I could even process it fully, a knock echoed from the barn doors. It was Karen. She stood with frost on her lashes, gloves that didn't match, and a look I'd never seen on her before, something between desperation and shame. Behind her stood 2 more board members, Justin, the landscape harmony coordinator, and a woman named Valerie, who usually ran the HOA newsletter. Their faces were pale, hollow. It was no longer about control. They were cold, hungry, defeated. I opened the door halfway. "Evening," I said. Karen spoke first. Her voice was dry brittle. We need help." I didn't answer, just let the words hang in the air. "Our gas line's frozen," Valerie added. "We haven't had heat in 2 days. We're out of food. The deliveries, they haven't come. No trucks, nothing." I looked at Karen, who for once couldn't meet my eyes. I thought about the generator, the fuel tank, the bolts. I thought about the boy who came asking for soup, the families with infants. And I thought about my father, who would have told me that justice isn't revenge, it's accountability. So I stepped aside, but only an inch. "You'll need to sign in," I said, handing her a clipboard. She took it with shaking hands. "What is this?" "An acknowledgement," I said. "That you acted outside the scope of your authority. That you obstructed emergency logistics. That you put people in harm's way because of ego." Her eyes widened. "You want me to confess? I want you to tell the truth. You sign this, you get soup and heat. You can walk back through the snow." Valerie looked horrified. "That's extortion." "No," I said, "it's clarity." Karen stared at the page. For a moment, I thought she might crumble. But then slowly she signed. I took the form, filed it into my records, and pointed to the makeshift benches near the generator heater. "Over there, stay quiet, and don't touch anything." They shuffled in silent as ghosts. By nightfall, the barn was running like a full relief center. The delivery arrived at dawn, a state vehicle with official insignia driven by a woman in a yellow parka and a clipboard full of orders. "Mr. Holt," she asked. "That's me. We've got 2,000 pounds of shelf-stable grain, 120 trauma packs, solar blankets, and 2 pallets of MREs. Let's offload to the side bay." She hesitated. "Do you have volunteers?" I looked behind me. Half the neighborhood was already up, bundled, tired, but ready. "We do now." By noon, a line stretched from my driveway down to the edge of the Willowbrook walking trail. People arrived with sleds, backpacks, wagons. No one pushed. No one cut. The HOA-issued name tags were gone. All that was left were neighbors. Karen stayed in the back nursing a thermos of hot tea. She didn't speak to anyone, but she watched. And maybe that was enough for now. Because for the first time in 6 days, there was a sense of order in the chaos. Not imposed, not legislated, but earned. I didn't need a title, or a newsletter, or a badge. All I needed was grain warmth and the truth. And now I had all 3. By the 8th day of the blackout, the temperature plummeted to a record low. 20 below zero with wind chill according to the emergency broadcast. Willow Brook looked like a ghost town trees, bowed under thick coats of ice driveways, buried satellite dishes dangling powerless. What once was a pristine HOA manicured community now looked like the ruins of a dream built on trim codes and arrogance. Inside the barn, we were pushing capacity. Cots and blankets lined the sidewalls. Battery-operated lanterns gave off a warm amber glow, casting long shadows against stacked grain bins. Kids huddled together around makeshift card games. Elderly couples slept hand in hand under wool blankets. There was laughter sometimes, singing even. People shared what they had: lip balm, playing cards, spare gloves. Humanity bloomed in the cold. And somewhere in the far corner, under a pile of layered scarves and quiet humiliation, sat Karen Halstead. She hadn't said a word since signing the acknowledgement. Valerie was there too, helping portion oatmeal into reusable containers. And Justin, surprisingly, had become one of our most reliable helpers. I caught him clearing paths between cots and making lists of people who needed medication refills. By that point, we'd established a rhythm. Meals 3 times a day. Hot drinks hourly. A rotating team for snow shoveling inventory checks and fuel conservation. The state had delivered a second shipment this time, with children's supplies, basic antibiotics, and extra solar blankets. I'd started keeping a hand-drawn roster of every person we'd served. We were up to 143. That morning, I heard my name shouted from the gate. Not yelled, shouted. Granger Holt, please." I stepped outside. The wind was so sharp it stole my breath for a moment. At the gate stood Mark and Tanya Davenport, Karen's second-in-command and HOA treasurer, respectively. Mark was still in his overpriced peacoat, but his gloves were mismatched and his lips were blue. Tanya's eyes were red from either cold or crying, or both. I opened the gate just wide enough to step out, not invite them in. "Something wrong?" I asked. Mark's breath came in short puffs. "We need your help." I didn't say anything. Tanya stepped forward. "Our daughter Anna, she's asthmatic. We ran out of medication yesterday. We tried the clinic, but no one's answering. The roads are still blocked." And she swallowed. "Our pipes burst last night. The kitchen is underwater and the bedrooms are frozen through. We can't stay there." Mark tried to stand tall, but his voice cracked. "We thought we could manage. We didn't think it would get this bad." I looked at both of them, then behind them. A truck idled by the curb. 2 kids huddled in the back seat, fogging up the windows with their breath. "Bring them in," I said. "No clipboard this time, just your word." Mark blinked. "Our word. That if this storm ends and you try to go back to your old ways, if you even think about picking up another HOA citation book, you remember this week. You remember how your rules nearly got people killed." He nodded quickly. "Yes, I swear, I'll resign." I turned to Tanya. She hesitated, then whispered, "I already did." I led them inside. Karen looked up briefly as they entered, but said nothing. She just pulled her scarf closer and stared into the lantern light. I gave their daughter an emergency inhaler from the new supplies high box and placed their son next to a cot near the heater. He fell asleep within minutes, face slack with exhaustion. Later that evening, Mark pulled me aside. "We've called an emergency board session," he said. Most of us are stepping down." I raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" He nodded. "There's nothing left to control, no irrigation to monitor, no fences to argue over, just people who are scared and cold and realizing that all the rules in the world don't matter if there's no one left to enforce them." He paused, eyes welling up. "And no one who wants to anymore." I let that settle between us. Karen sat alone during dinner. I placed a bowl of soup near her, just like I did for everyone else. She didn't thank me, but she didn't refuse it either. Later that night, she stood by the barn door watching snowfall in waves of quiet white. I joined her silent. She finally spoke. "My husband left town the night before the storm hit. Took a business trip to Phoenix. I begged him not to go. I didn't say anything." She continued. "He hasn't called. Not once. I think I spent so much time trying to run everything around me that I didn't see what was falling apart inside." I looked at her not with anger, but pity. "You mistook authority for purpose." She nodded slowly. "I did." We stood in silence a while longer. The wind outside had changed. Softer now, less biting. The storm was breaking. That next morning, a final box arrived, delivered by a sheriff deputy with chains on his tires and an official letterhead. The letter was from the Office of Emergency Management. It read, "In recognition of his exemplary service, Granger Holt is hereby granted full designation as Emergency Auxiliary Command for all matters of supply and distribution within the boundaries of Willow County for the duration of the declared emergency. And in handwriting at the bottom, "You've done more with one barn than most cities could with a stadium. Keep going." I taped it next to the others right under Karen's fines and the first cease and desist letter. By then, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. By the 9th day, the storm broke wide open. It didn't melt right away, not yet, but the silence in the air had changed. The sky brightened no longer that leaden gray that weighed on your chest. You could feel the thaw coming, smell it in the breeze. The drip of icicles from barn rafters was the first music any of us had heard in over a week. And for the first time, I saw people smile without fear behind it. But I knew what came next. Storms don't just break. They leave debris, political, emotional, legal. And the cleanup is where the old games try to crawl back in. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to let the HOA crawl out of this wreckage and pretend they hadn't spent months trying to crush me. I wasn't going to let them slide back into power on softened apologies and selective memory. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. That morning, I gathered the remaining members of the HOA board, those who hadn't already resigned, and called a meeting. Not in their chandeliered clubhouse, but in my barn, with the walls still hung with their threatening letters and newspaper clippings. The barn had become more than shelter. It was a reckoning place. Justin and Valerie showed up early, hands still in Mitten's faces, weary but humble. Karen came last. She looked thinner than when this all started. Not physically, though the lack of power had worn on everyone, but spiritually. Like someone who'd realized the crown she wore for years was made of paper. She sat quietly, on an overturned bucket legs, crossed, eyes low. I cleared my throat. This neighborhood survived, I began, not because of bylaws or paint codes, not because of landscaping guides or mailbox uniformity. We survived because people stopped listening to authority and started listening to each other. A few heads nodded. "I'm not interested in payback," I said, "but I am interested in accountability." I pulled out a small stack of papers. The top page bore the title, Community Autonomy and Land Sovereignty Agreement. It wasn't complicated. 3 points. 1. The HOA acknowledges that my land is not, and never has been, under its jurisdiction. 2. The HOA retracts all citations, fines, or actions taken against me since the first grain delivery blockade. 3. All remaining board members agree to step down effective immediately and cease any governance activity unless a new structure, one inclusive and voluntary, is voted on by the entire neighborhood. Karen read it first. Her hands trembled as she held the paper. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She just asked, "Will it be public?" "Already is," I replied, nodding toward the reporter's notepad. Delia was seated quietly in the back, taking notes for her follow-up story. Karen signed. So did Valerie. Then Justin. The rest followed. When the last signature hit the page, I stood. This isn't the end of community. It's the beginning. A real one. One where leadership doesn't mean control. It means service. There was no applause, just silence. And then Karen stood. She walked over to the barn wall where I'd taped her original letter about aesthetic violations, the one with the grain bin circled in red ink. She looked at it for a long time. Then, without a word, she took it down. Later that day, I walked the perimeter of my land. Not because I needed to patrol, those days were done, but because I needed to see it again through new eyes. The fields were blanketed in snow, but underneath life was waiting. Milo seed, wheat rows, oats in quiet readiness. It struck me then this wasn't just about survival. It was about stewardship. Back inside, I pulled down the old chalkboard from my shed and began sketching a new layout, an idea that had lived in the back of my mind for years. A resilience farm. A place where neighbors could learn to plant, preserve, prepare. A space where food, not fear, was stored. A week later, I held the first meeting. Not a board meeting. A gathering. No clipboards, no bylaws. Just people eager to learn how to build raised beds, store water, tend chickens, and run solar backup. Even the HOA's old enforcers came. One man brought his teenage son. Another brought a casserole. Karen came too. She didn't speak, but she stayed until the end, helping clean up afterward in silence. That night, I lit the stove in the barn and sat with the last 2 guests as the coals burned low. "Why didn't you fight them sooner?" one of them asked. "You had the knowledge, the maps, the law." I thought for a moment, staring into the flickering orange light. "Because knowing how to fight doesn't mean you always should," I said. "Sometimes you wait. Let them hang themselves with their own rope. And when they finally reach for help, you give it but only if they come without their crown. The barn creaked softly around us, wind sliding through the eaves like a whisper of what had passed. Tomorrow the thaw would begin, but tonight we rested, knowing we'd earned every minute of it. Spring came slower than usual that year. The ice didn't vanish overnight. It peeled back inch by inch like a scab healing across the earth. Beneath it, the soil groaned and softened the way I imagine a heart does after it's been hardened too long. The land didn't hold a grudge, it just waited patient and faithful like it always had. So did I. For the first time in months, the barn stood quiet. No cots, no soup lines, no solar blankets. Just the creak of wood and the smell of grain. The emergency had passed. Power was back. Supply trucks rumbled again down the highway. And yet everything was different now. The HOA was gone, formally dissolved 2 weeks after the final signatures. The remaining board members handed over their keys, deactivated the website, and canceled their contracts. Karen moved into a smaller home on the edge of town. I heard she was taking care of her elderly mother now. I didn't see her often. But when I did, she gave a small nod like someone still paying down a debt they now understand. The residents of Willowbrook didn't mourn the HOA's death. In fact, they thrived in its absence. Without daily notices, neighbors began talking. Without enforcement, they began helping. Someone planted a community garden in the cul-de-sac where the HOA once banned tomatoes. Kids played in yards, no longer under surveillance. And no one ever mentioned aesthetic violations again. Meanwhile, I kept building. The barn became more than a barn. We started with weekend workshops, intro to canning, soil testing, composting 101. I built a teaching kitchen using reclaimed wood and old stainless countertops from a closed diner. We repurposed the HOA's folding chairs and their projector, the same one that once displayed my grain bins like a threat. Funny how tools change with hands. We called the new center the Willow Resilience Collective. It wasn't a nonprofit, not officially. Just people. People who'd felt powerless during the storm and didn't want to feel that way again. We shared what we knew. We stocked supplies. We trained teens on basic electrical systems, taught parents how to keep a pantry that could feed a family for weeks, not just days. I used to think of myself as a soldier turned farmer. Now I think I've become something else. A steward, not just of land, but of memory, of responsibility, of the quiet kind of leadership that doesn't ask for titles or votes, just presence. One morning in May, a boy named Nico, same one who came asking for food that first night, ran up to the gate with a paper in his hand. "Mr. Holt," he called. "We made this for you." It was a drawing, hand-colored in pencil and crayon. A barn with the sun rising behind it and the words, "Where the warmth came from." I kept it, framed it even. There were still bumps, of course. Not everyone agreed on how things should be done. But the difference now was simple: people asked instead of demanded, offered instead of enforced. And when problems arose, we didn't find each other. We knocked on doors. Sometimes people ask me what changed everything. What made the HOA finally collapse? Was it the storm, the article, the resignation letters? I don't think it was any of that, really. It was a boy with a sick sister. It was a generator that kept humming when others failed. It was a barn full of strangers becoming neighbors again. And it was the truth. That rules mean nothing without humanity. That preparedness is not paranoia. That community cannot be forced. It must be chosen. Months later, I stood at the edge of my field as the first wheat sprouts pushed through the earth, green blades slicing through brown like hope returning. I closed my eyes and listened. No cars, no HOA trucks, no Karen. Just the wind. Soft, forgiving. And behind me, laughter from the barn where a dozen kids learned how to start a garden from seed. The place they once tried to shut down was now feeding minds as well as mouths. I thought back to my father. How he used to say, "The land knows the truth. It never lies." He was right. And now, so do the people. Because when the storm came, the ones who hoarded power lost it. And the ones who stored grain, we fed the world.